are joining. This is our second visitor that we get, and this is Reese Pearsall. I think many of you probably know Reese. He's been around for a little bit, but he's going to kind of help us learn a little bit about the world of compliance. I'll let him dive into that. But before that, if you don't know Reese, Reese is kind of a really cool person that you might want to connect with. He's actually, again, another MSU alum. So, here we're trying to grow your network and basically show you what people do after they graduate here. Reese is actually kind of unique in that he graduated just this past summer, but then he pretty much immediately started grad school. And actually, he's been working with me this past year. He's been a graduate TA. He's kind of ramping up some cool research in the space of malware analysis, and kind of interested in some issues there. He's also working with Hoplite. He teaches courses in his copious amounts of spare time. I mean, this guy is getting after it. So I think we have a lot to learn from him, and hopefully we'll have lots of great questions and be super engaging with some of the topics he's going to share with us today. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Reese.
Thanks, Travis. If you don't know me, my name is Reese. I like to think that I'm a pretty familiar face around the computer science departments. I've been around here for a while now. And so teaching a computer security class like this is something I want to do in the near future. And so having this opportunity to come in and talk with you guys about some security related stuff really means a lot to me. So thank you, Travis, for having me on. I'm here to talk with you today about compliance, which is a very kind of important idea of how we implement security mechanisms in industry and in the real world. And I know Ryan kind of threw this out yesterday, but I'm going to put a disclaimer out there too. I'm not an expert in compliance or Linux, and so just put that out there. I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. But I have worked closely with a lot of these ideas before, so I know that on your final lab there's some questions about some of the stuff we talked about today, and so I'm going to make sure that I cover everything that you need to know for that. And also, I have a piece of advice. I took this class last year, and I decided to do the final lab all in one day before the deadline, and I would not recommend doing that. It was pretty awful, so that's my advice. Take it or leave it. Do as I say, not as I do, as Travis likes to say. Cool. So before we jump into that, I'm just going to quickly talk a little bit about me, who I am, and how I got here. Like Travis said, I'm currently a graduate student under Travis here. I've enjoyed working with him, and hopefully he has enjoyed working with me as well. I got my undergraduate degree here as well. I got a minor in sociology as well. I'm interested in cybersecurity as a whole, but I'm more interested in things like cybercrime. And right now I'm focused on malware analysis and detection. I've done some TAing and some teaching around here that you might know me from there. Or if you took operating systems last semester, you might know me from there as well. As far as kind of some industry experience, as an undergraduate, I did some internships at TechLink, which is kind of a government patent software kind of company here in town, where I worked as a software engineering intern and software tester. I also spent some time with the Air Force down on Hill Air Force Base in Utah, where I worked as a software engineer working on some really cool radar technology, and that was a lot of fun. Right now, I am a software engineer at Hoplite Industries. I've been there for about a year now, and I actually met them through the capstone program here at MSU. I was part of the interdisciplinary capstone, and they sponsored one of the projects, and so I kind of worked on a project for them for my capstone project, my undergraduate, and then when I finished with that, they kind of offered me a job to continue working with them, and so I've been with them since. Hoplite Industries is a cybersecurity solutions company. They do a lot in active network defense and threat monitoring and threat detection and threat intelligence, things like that. It's been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed working with them. They're all great, and I mostly work as a software engineer. My job title is kind of confusing. I call myself a software engineer. And then I left some other things I like to do outside of academia, but this is a little bit about me if you don't know me. Feel free to say hi if you ever see me around. I'm still going to be around for another couple years. All right, so we're going to jump into compliance now, and to start off, we're going to start off with a group activity. Now, don't worry, we're not doing breakout rooms. We're just going to do a little bit of group thinking and group participation. So I might ask you to unmute your mic or type in classroom chat. I have that open as well. We're going to start with that some activity to get us in kind of the right mindset for thinking about compliance. So, let's say that COVID is finally over, everybody's vaccinated, it's completely gone, and so you and everybody else in the world are gonna do something really fun. You're gonna take a road trip to Miami, and you're gonna party hard, you're gonna go to the beach, you're gonna black out, everybody, maybe just me, but you're gonna be going on a road trip with some friends, and you're gonna be driving there in this minivan. Now, you just purchased this used car that you've never driven before, and you don't really know much about it, okay? The person you bought it from didn't maybe tell you a lot, you never gave it a test drive, you don't know too much about it. Don't ask why, but this is the case. So, before you and your friends leave here in this used Dodge Caravan to go to Miami, what kind of inspections or checks should you conduct to ensure that nothing goes wrong while traveling? Now, you don't need to get super technical here. I don't know very much about cars, but just from a high level, what might be good to check out about this used car? So feel free to unmute, or class chat is another great way of talking here. Okay.
I'd want to drive this thing around the block a few times before I take it on the road trip.
Yeah, like a test drive, that's perfectly great. Logan in class chat says tire checks. Brake checks, oil checked, windshield washer check. Does the engine start? I think those are all really awesome things that need to be conducted before you drive. The fuel level, awesome, yeah. So yeah, like we have all these basic things like checking, the tire pressure. The brakes are an important part. The headlights, yes, things like that. That's all awesome. Thank you for. Feel free to keep typing away. So what we can do maybe is like we could have. Some kind of like checklist before we go. It's like, here's all the things that might be good to check. Here's a few things that I came up with: tire pressure, oil. Is there any warning lights on the dashboard? If there is, do you need to worry about them? I've had warning lights on my car for like 3 years now, and I've been fine since. So here's some things that we might need to check, right? Now, I'm going to tweak this scenario just a little bit. And I agree with Colton with the old like hearing check. I think that's kind of how I go about my taking care of my car. So let's tweak this a little bit. Let's suppose that Miami didn't happen, and now we're going to the wonderful city of Fairbanks, Alaska, in the middle of January, okay? You're going to drive to Bozeman all the way north to Fairbanks. You're in the middle of winter. Is our checklist going to be the same? Is there anything we might need to worry about differently now?
You might make sure that
Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just gonna say you might make sure that you have like stuff in there just in case you get stuck. So like a snow shovel or something, or like chains for your car.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so like checking the tire treads. Winter tires. Maybe like a winter kit that has, I don't know, maybe some food or blankets, some things like that. Yeah, it would be good to look at like snow warnings, road closures, snow brush. Exactly. We can remove the swimsuits from the luggage. Yeah, there's probably some things we don't need in Fairbanks, Alaska anymore. So what I'm trying to show you is that our list is going to look similar, but there's probably going to be a few more things we need to kind of worry about. So I added things like winter tires, maybe having some winter kit, and putting some antifreeze in the radiator, whatever that means. I got that from online. Okay, cool. Thank you for that. This is going to, so we have kind of this checklist here of things we need to check. Now let's apply this to something a little bit more relevant to us. Let's suppose that you were hired as a system administrator, or maybe just some system architect or some developer at a local tech company. Okay? Your boss asks you to evaluate some company work server, which is running a version of Ubuntu. Now your boss wants to make sure that there are no vulnerabilities with the current system. Now this is pretty broad, but you can kind of just think about like this server, employees have their own accounts, they put files on here, you run some software on here, there's a bunch of different files. So your job is to kind of look at everything on the server and make sure that There's no possible like vulnerabilities or risks to worry about here. So this is pretty open-ended. There's tons of correct answers here. What sort of things might you want to check on this system? Now think about some of the things you've learned this semester in terms of maybe like mechanisms for countering some vulnerabilities or some different settings. What do you think here? There's tons of different answers, so feel free to answer away.
I would probably first check for firewalls and if there are them or how they're configured.
Awesome. Yeah, I think presence of a firewall is very important. Bowen says...
Just check like...
Go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to say, just check the password for like admin accounts to make sure that they like have passwords that aren't just like the defaults, stuff like that.
Yeah, like password security, password complexity. That's great. I agree with that. Bowen says, making sure the general system is updated. I agree with that. That's awesome. Colton says, check any open ports. I think that is also good. Making sure if there's any open ports, making sure that nobody can maybe access those, other networking stuff. Totally, yeah. Anything else?
My big first thing would probably be to check backup schema and make sure that the most recent backups are up to date.
Yeah, so backups, totally, yeah. I think that's really important, the presence of backups and making sure those backups are up to date. That's great, yeah. Password policies, yep. What other stuff have you learned about in the class? Maybe certain settings to turn on or certain programs maybe? What are we thinking?
Make sure it's not running a version of Bash from before 2014.
Yes, that's awesome. Yeah, I kind of forgot about that, but yeah, making sure the Bash version is not vulnerable to shell shock. Yeah, that's great. Okay, anything else?
There was the whole like SQL thing that honestly I don't remember what the program was that was needed, but you needed to separate that that like query that goes and actually queries SQL.
Yeah,
I forget what it was called.
Like
wasn't that prepared statements?
Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah, awesome. Jeremiah totally kind of hit the nail on head of kind of the first thing I was thinking of, which is make sure ASLR is on. So everybody give a clap react to Jeremiah in class chat. Because, yeah, like ASLR was one really important kind of setting we turned on to maybe prevent potential buffer overflow attacks from happening. So, like, what we could do is, like, hey, let's make sure this server has ASLR on. And if it is, then we might not have to worry about potential buffer overflow attacks. So that's great. And it's also important, yeah, to check, like, password strengths, making sure everything's updated, things like that. So that's awesome. Now I'm going to add one small component to this, is what if we say that this server now interacts with some SQL database, maybe it's some web application, where a user can input some string that ends up getting kind of put into a SQL statement for this database. And I think Joaquin totally kind of mentioned this idea of we might have to worry about SQL injections now. Making sure that some employee or somebody using this machine isn't able to modify or delete tables or access things they shouldn't. So what I want this to show is that when we add on a small component, that kind of opens up a new can of worms per se of potential new things we might need to worry about. Okay, so the point of this was just to kind of get you in the right mindset of in order to kind of create a safe environment, oftentimes it's useful to kind of create like a checklist of things we might need to check for: password strength, potential SQL injections, making sure we're using prepared statements, things like that. Okay, so compliance. We'll move on to compliance here. So compliance is all about just ensuring that certain rules and policies are being followed, and that these companies are meeting some security-related requirements. Okay, now these requirements and rules and policies are usually created by some third party government agency or some industry standards. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to take some snapshot of this company we were hired for's technical infrastructure, and we're going to make sure that it follows some kind of regulatory framework. Okay? We're going to make sure that it meets the requirements set by some industry standard or some government standard. Now, hopefully in the first maybe couple weeks of class, I think Travis might have mentioned this CIA triad, this confidentiality, integrity, availability, which is, if you remember, it's kind of like the three most important aspects of security, three fundamental foundation ideas. And so compliance is going to help us maintain the CIA triad and make sure that we're not breaking any of these, foundations of this triad. Okay? Let's see. Oops. I want to point out really quick is that compliance and security are pretty separate to each other. Compliance is much more boring, unfortunately. With security, we get to worry about technical aspects and certain mechanisms and certain technical aspects of our system. Whereas compliance, we're more worried about kind of the legal side of things or the policy side of things. We're trying to mitigate some risks for our company and making sure that we're documenting and meeting the standards of some required framework. Okay? Now, what are these frameworks? These rules and policies that are being followed are going to be structured as some compliance framework, which is just a structured list or set of guidelines and best practices that details a company's processes for meeting regulatory requirements. So there's kind of a lot there, but essentially it's just a list of guidelines and rules that were made by government agencies or third-party industry standards, right? There are many different types of compliance frameworks. It's not just only one. The framework that a company utilizes is going to vary by what the company does and what kind of data the company deals with. If you have some kind of engineering job right now, you might be aware that there's certain rules that you have to follow, or there's things that you can and can't do. This might be a part of a framework. Okay, so for example, companies that deal with credit card information, if they process it or store it, there are certain rules and standards that they have to follow. Okay, that is a standard they have to meet the requirement of. HIPAA, which I think we might have all heard of by now, that's also like a framework, right? Companies that deal with sensitive patient health information, they have rules and standards they have to follow too. Okay, and if they don't meet the requirements, then there can be issues, as we'll talk about in a little bit. And lastly, there is NIST. This is kind of the titan of kind of compliance and standards and rules. It's the National Institute of Standard and Technology. I think Travis might have mentioned NIST when talking about some cryptography stuff, but this is just kind of the general framework used frequently for government agencies and things like that. So these compliance frameworks are just certain rules that need to be followed. Okay? I think to get a better understanding of this, we're going to dive deep into one of these frameworks. We're going to be talking about the STIG compliance framework, which is what I deal with most of the time. STIG, or the Security Technical Implementation Guide, is a compliance framework that was made by DISA, which is just kind of a Department of Defense kind of like sub-agency, or they fit in somewhere into DoD. And these rules are pretty much targeted for the configuration of computer systems and kind of network systems. And so I have a kind of a table here of products that are sorted by the total number of distinct vulnerabilities. And this is from 2019. These numbers are based on how many CVEs were found, which is CVEs are just some publicly known vulnerability in some product. Okay? And so I point this out is that these different products and these different operating systems here, there are a number of vulnerabilities found, and there's new vulnerabilities found every day. and oftentimes they're not totally secure. And so what STIG tries to do is that they have this set of rules or guidelines that help you configure how these computers, how they should be configured. Okay? So, for example, here is an example of one of the rules and one of these guidelines. I call this, the framework is called STIG, but I call one rule a STIG, so this is one STIG. This rule says, this is for Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So if a company has a Red Hat Enterprise Linux system, here's one rule that they would have to follow. And it says, the Red Hat Linux operating system must be configured to disable USB mass storage. Okay? My question is, why would this be a rule? If we're concerned about security, why would they to make this a rule? What could this potentially be solving?
A security vulnerability when you store mass in the USB slot.
Okay. Why is that a vulnerability? Or like, what could possibly go wrong?
Is it possible that the USB storage slot is configured for energy only?
That's not what I am quite thinking of.
Is it
Can
just?
you just
Is it just to?
think what?
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, is it just to keep someone from sticking a USB and taking, a bunch of information from the computer?
That's part of it. And so the idea here is that a USB drive is some untrusted source. We don't know what's on that USB drive. It could be nothing, or it could potentially have malicious files or malicious intent. USB storage permits easy introduction of unknown devices, which could have malicious intentions. And so, for example, there are these USB drives that are specifically made to carry out some attack when plugged into some computer. These bash bunnies here, they are programmed to run or execute some payload when they're plugged in. I have a friend that purchased one of these, and what he did is that he kind of created this payload that would, once plugged into the computer, would open up internet browser and go to the Rickroll YouTube video. And so whenever he plugged this in, it would Rickroll, whoever was, on the computer, for example. And so now that's not really malicious unless you think getting Rickrolled in 2021 is malicious, which, could be. But think about what bad things somebody could try to do. There could be some malicious payload that could try to, try to phone home to some, malware repository to download something, or it might try to carry out some buffer overflow attack. And so what we're trying to do here is we're trying to eliminate this potential threat. If we disable USB storage altogether, then this type of attack is not possible. Okay? So what we're trying to do here is we have this list of rules that's going to help us configure this Red Hat operating system to prevent attacks like these from happening. This is just one rule of many. Okay? Here's another rule. This rule, also for Red Hat Linux, says that the system must be configured so that the root account must be the only account having unrestricted access to the system. Okay? Why might this be a rule? What are we trying to prevent from happening here?
If you're able to minimize the number of trusted parties to have unrestricted access, that's just always a good policy.
Yeah, so you're correct. It's, I think, Travis, you guys might have talked about this idea of least privilege, which is kind of this idea of a user should have the least amount of privilege to do the thing that they need to do. And so you're right. It's like, if we give everybody unrestricted access, it's like things could potentially go wrong. And so permissions are important. Someone who has root permissions or unrestricted access to the system could potentially, have access to the system. They could mess up the entire system, or they could try to, try to brute force guess a password for some other, different account. Okay? So, this rule says, hey, let's make sure that the root account is the only account that can access everything, so that we don't have to worry about some flustered employee or some hacker to not have them destroy the entire system. Okay? So, those were just 2 STIGs. Those are just 2 rules for the Red Hat system. There are 248 different rules that need to be checked. They might be a little different now because these rules get added and deleted as time goes on. So what I'm trying to say is that there are tons of different rules that help you configure this Red Hat system. And there are many STIGs, so there's a lot of different rules for all the different operating systems and applications that you can think of. So if you have an Apache server running, there are rules and guidelines for how to go about configuring that. Apple operating system, Adobe Acrobat. You might not think that Adobe Acrobat is something we need to worry about, but if you think about a typical kind of business or company, Adobe Acrobat is going to be used a lot for viewing PDFs or signing PDFs or sending documents to one another. And so it's important to make sure that it's configured properly so there's no vulnerabilities that could get exploited. Okay. And there's there's rules for internet browsers, for physical devices like Cisco devices or IBM devices. Windows 10 has a little under 300 rules that need to be checked. And so there's tons of different rules for these different applications and operating systems. In class chat, they said, are there scripts or something that you can download to configure these devices automatically? Yes. We're going to talk about that later on, but the answer is yes. It would seem like it's a pain to go through manually and make sure everything, all these 200 rules are met. And so we do try to make this more efficient by automating this idea of checking these different rules. Okay? We'll talk about that here soon. There is this website called StigViewer, and I use this all the time for looking at different STIGs. And I have this, I'll drag it over here. And so you can see on the home page is that they kind of have a list of the latest STIGs that they've released. And so notice that, even in 2021 and even in 2020, it's like we're releasing new STIGs every time because new technology comes out, new technology gets updated, new threats come out. And so STIGs is a way of, we're trying to keep up with new vulnerabilities and things like that. And so we're constantly releasing new rules. And so if I go to the STIGs, you can see the list of all the different applications and operating systems that it covers. So you saw all the Apple applications, the Google stuff, Java runtime environment, if they're doing Java development, Microsoft stuff. I'm going to go to Red Hat Linux. That's what we looked at before. And so here is a list of all the different rules that need to be checked. And so we can see that there's a long list of all the stuff that needs to be checked. And, there's different, severity levels. And so, some rules might be more important than others, obviously. But there's tons of different rules here. And if you click on, one of them, even this one just says, hey, make sure there's a firewall installed. And so it kind of gives you a little description of what it all, kind of description of why this is. And it also gives you some commands to run, which we'll look at here soon. But this is a super great site to look at individual STIGs and to look at all the rules that a company might need to follow. Okay, let's see. Oh, okay, yeah, so I just want to quickly mention that the stuff we learn in 476 here is very relevant to the stuff that we check in STIGs. The different vulnerabilities and the different kinds of attacks you guys learn about are very much so concerns when we're checking these rules. So here's a STIG for Red Hat Linux 6 now that says the audit system on the machine must be configured to audit all the uses of setuid and setgid programs. So a setgid program, from my understanding, is the same thing as a setuid, but it changes like the group bit value for what group you're in. And so why might we want to audit this? Well, as you guys probably saw, setuid programs can be great, for things like changing a password. But they can also be exploited, as you saw when you have a setuid program that might utilizes something like the system call or the thing like the exec call. Okay? And so what we're trying to do here is logging all these uses of these programs can help monitor for unusual activity or to identify malicious events. So in the case that if the company was breached or attacked, they could look back at the logs and potentially see that maybe the root of this was a set UID program. And so we're trying to kind of, cover up potential holes in our system, or making sure that we're keeping information that is important to us. Okay. Next up, this is for Ubuntu, and it says the Ubuntu operating system must implement address space layout randomization to protect its memory from unauthorized code execution. I think we touched about this earlier, but this is a really important thing we need to check for. Making sure ASLR is on is one of the top defenses against potential buffer overflow attacks. And if we make sure it's enabled, then that will help prevent potential future buffer overflow attacks. Now, one thing I will mention is that I kind of learned this after I took security class. It's something I didn't really think about, is just because you have ASLR enabled, that does not mean that you are completely immune to buffer overflow attacks. It's still possible to bypass ASLR, and I don't know, I didn't really think about this until when Travis and we kind of watched this presentation about this guy who had a virtual machine on his on his host machine, and he was able to execute arbitrary code outside of the virtual machine on the host machine that had ASLR. And so like ASLR, you can brute force it. Right, I kind of remember that the idea here is that we're trying to prevent potential cyber risks from happening, or potential attacks, and so this will help mitigate a large number of potential buffer overflow attacks, but once again does not mean that you are completely immune to some of those attacks. Okay. One thing that the STIG offers is kind of this checklist for application development and security. And so this is kind of like a checklist of things the developer needs to think of when they're developing some application. And so I found some stuff in here that is relevant to some of the stuff you learned in 476. This one says, make sure that the application does not have cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. And so it says, hey, this is something you need to worry about when you are developing your application. Try to play around with some of like the URL strings or some of the cookie stuff to help identify potential XSS attacks. Okay. There's another that says, hey, check for SQL injections. If you are using some SQL database, make sure that you are using some prepared statements, or make sure that there's a boundary between the user input and the code being executed on a computer, right? And so it says, hey, play around with some of the SQL query strings. Try to put slash or 1 is equal to 1 in there and see if you can get a SQL injection. So it says, try to play around with some things and make sure there's no SQL injections. And lastly, make sure that there are no command injection vulnerabilities. And so it says, take a look at your code and make sure that you aren't using things like system or exec something or popen or the thing in Python or the thing in PHP. And so once again, we're trying to prevent potential command injections. Hopefully you learned that system is like the worst thing ever. Don't ever touch it, because you can kind of chain commands together. Okay, so kind of just trying to show you that I'm trying to kind of summarize in a nice way of all the different things that you learned about in the semester, and show you that this is stuff we have to worry about in industry. Lastly, just some cryptography stuff. This is for Red Hat 8, and it says all stored passwords must be encrypted with an approved cryptographic hashing algorithm. And so it says it has to be FIPS 142 approved. That is a different kind of compliance framework. And so I looked into it, and there's like a 70-page government document to look into it. But essentially this means like, hey, use SHA-256, SHA-512. It also said that SHA-1 was okay, which is kind of strange because I thought that got cracked pretty recently. So maybe I wasn't looking at the most updated version. But once again, these are rules that companies have to make sure they're following. Lastly, for Microsoft Office, if you have some Microsoft Office application, once again, somebody might not think about this in terms of security, but Microsoft Office is things used all the time by security or by general companies. And so it says that the encryption type for password protected files and things like that must be set. So this is just making sure that documents are encrypted using a valid encryption type like AES 256 or RSA, so that somebody else couldn't intercept some unencrypted data or something they shouldn't be able to. Okay. One thing I'll mention is that so far we've looked at very technical aspects of compliance. We're looking at specific technical settings or configurations for computer systems. One thing to note is that these rules aren't always like computer related. There are often physical, like real life aspects of compliance. These are things like making sure that employees wear badges, visitors must be checked in, doors must remain locked after hours, photography not allowed, you can't leave the door open for the person behind you, and things like that. So there are often, physical aspects of this stuff too, and there are this level of security, right? It's going to vary. Like the NSA is going to have different compliance standards than some ma and pa like bookshop, for example. When I worked for the Air Force, there were like some serious security rules we had to follow, or else we would like get in trouble. So there are kind of real life aspects of compliance as well. So I know the slide looks awful, but why do we care about this? We have all these STIGs. Why do we care about following them? Like, isn't it just kind of like common sense, I guess? The idea is that it might be a requirement to be compliant with these rules. If you think about, like, if a government agency wanted to do business with some contractor, right? The government might have sensitive data they might have to forward to this company. And so they might say, like, hey, if you want to do business with us, you have to be compliant with this framework. You have to be STIG compliant, or you have to be NIST compliant, okay? And that is part of the contract. And if they violate those rules, it could be like a hefty fine, or some termination of contract could happen. Oftentimes, there are like auditors or some representative that will come out and verify that you are being compliant with whatever framework you claim to be, okay? So there is kind of like enforcement aspect to this. Let's see. The information of whether or not their company is meeting these security requirements is important information to company executives, auditors, or system administrators. So oftentimes, it might be a requirement of the company. They might have to meet X level of compliance in order to do business with this or deal with this kind of data. Okay. The main idea is, like, why should we care about compliance, or why is it important? If a company is being compliant with their regulatory framework, then in theory they are less likely to be a victim of like a cyber attack or some data breach or getting some vulnerability exploited, because really this idea of STIGs and compliance in general is we're trying to patch up potential vulnerabilities from being exploited. We're trying to make sure that our data is safe. And really, we're trying to make sure that we are maintaining the CIA triad. Okay? So how do we go about checking for compliance? I know we asked earlier, it's like, is there a way to automate this? And the answer is yes, but the idea of checking for compliance, right? We saw maybe like 5 of 250 Red Hat STIGs. This process can be a headache for system administrators, because kind of what happens is some company executive or some CEO will come to the system administrator and they'll say, hey, can you make sure that we are being STIG compliant, or make sure that we're NIST compliant? And then the system administrator is like, oh, okay, fine. I guess I'll spend the rest of the day, running commands and making sure we're following all these rules. And with Hoplite, one thing I'm working on is trying to make this process easier for people, of automating this process and making sure that we're being compliant with some framework. For example, let's come back to this STIG where we have to make sure that ASLR is turned on. How do we check if ASLR is turned on? In this case, it's pretty easy. what we could do is we could have some bash script, or we could run some command that just checks to see the value of this randomized VA space variable, which I think in your lab, I think you turned on and then you turned off. And so it's kind of the same idea. And so I don't have a virtual box or a virtual machine to demo this live, but when I ran this on my Ubuntu, you can see that the output of that command was some value. And so the next part is like checking that output. And it says, okay, is whatever they outputted what we want? Like, what does it mean for ASLR to be turned on? And in this case, if it's set to 2, if 2 is the output, then that means ASLR is enabled, which is good. That means that we are being compliant with this specific rule. If we're following this rule, ASLR is turned on. That's great. Now, if nothing gets printed out or the output is not 2, then that means that ASLR is not enabled, which is a finding here. And a finding is just something that needs to be reported. It means that some STIG, some rule kind of like failed, and so we need to fix it somehow. And so in this case, if the output was not 2, all we need to do is just change that variable to 2, and then we're good to go. So all we have to do is we just need to probably run some command or some bash script. If you're on Windows, then all we have to do is do something very similar, but we use PowerShell. Stig Viewer does a really good job of explaining this process. Luckily, for the most part, we don't have to figure out these commands on our own. It kind of tells you, hey, run this command. The output should be this. If it's not this, then here's the fix, which is really nice. And here's a couple more. So here's the permissions one. Here, what we had to do is we had some awk script, which is just kind of a text processing language for Linux, and this prints out all the user identifiers on the system that have a UID of 0, and if there's something other than root, then that's a finding. That means that there's an account out there that has root privileges, and that's a finding. So here's what happens when you run it. For me, I didn't have anything else other than root. That's great. Root should be the only thing that gets printed out. For this USB one, the idea is that we're going to use grep to go through all the blacklisted items in the settings. I'm not totally sure how this how it works out in Linux, but this is going to print out all the blacklisted settings, and we should see that USB storage is kind of listed in this blacklist setting. In my case, nothing got printed out when I ran that, which means that USB storage was enabled. And in that case, that would be a finding because we failed this rule. We're not following that rule. But for me, it's my personal machine, so I'm not really concerned. There's probably other viruses on there anyway. Okay. The idea is that at some company, we have a lot of different applications and operating systems that might be in play. And so this means that there's a lot of STIGs, right? There's a bunch of different STIGs for Windows, there's a bunch of different STIGs for VMware, a bunch of different STIGs for Microsoft Office or for Java runtime environment. And it might seem like there are a lot of rules, and that is true. There are a lot of rules that we checked, and ideally, we want to see that we check the box on every single rule. We want to make sure that we are being compliant with every rule. That helps us ensure that we're preventing potential cyber risks from happening. And if we do check all the boxes, then we could say that we are being STIG compliant. And we are going to be less likely to be victim of some kind of cyber attack or breach in the future. In theory, right? It's still possible. And so it's a lot of stuff to check for. And there are some open source kind of tools on GitHub and things like that automate this process of making sure that you are being compliant with some framework. And so there are tools out there that makes this easier where you don't have to manually check everything, which is wonderful. So, I think that is mostly about it, what I wanted to talk about. But as just to kind of wrap things up, compliance is just one of the many ways of how we can implement security controls in industry. Things like making sure ASLR is turned on, making sure that SQL injection or SQL commands have some kind of prepared statement, or making sure that you aren't using a bad encryption algorithm. We can create rules for this that we can enforce companies to follow. And once again, there are many different frameworks that exist that provide standards and rules to help mitigate cyber attacks or cyber risks. It's all about mitigating risks here. And the things you learned in this class are legitimate concerns that are addressed in these frameworks. The stuff you learn in this class are, serious issues that are still you're worried about today. And as you go into the workforce and industry, you will likely probably have to go through some kind of compliance training, which isn't very exciting. It's just making sure that you don't download things you shouldn't, or making sure you don't use USB drives and things like that. So compliance, that is kind of about it here. Just kind of a way for us to make sure that businesses and companies are following rules and things like that. So that being said, I think that is pretty much what I wanted to go over today. So thank you for listening. If you're watching this, if you're watching the recording from home, I'm a little bit disappointed you couldn't make it, but thank you all for sitting through this. And now I'll take some questions. If you have any questions about compliance or security, grad school, careers, anything, etc. It's kind of a open time. If you want to ask any questions, I'm happy to try my best to answer.
I got a question, Reese. So compliance, to me, like, obviously it's good to make like tight programs that don't have any like security flaws, but is it more of like, does it provide companies with like legal protection? Is that like a majority of the reason why a company would like get STIG certified for whatever they're doing? Because like the average user probably isn't going to care that like, they're going to care that it's secure, but they're not going to care about like actually having all these like, they passed all these tests to be like, okay, cool, it sounds secure. But is it more so the fact that like if something does happen, they can say we took all of like the means we could possibly do to protect our system, so it's not our fault that somebody broke into it?
Yeah, I think it definitely is kind of a legal aspect. Like a company could claim that they are writing safe code and there's nothing to worry about. But being compliant with a framework is proof that they are meeting standards and that they're writing safe code and things like that. So oftentimes it is kind of like, kind of like a legal thing where it's a requirement for some contract, or it is kind of just like proof that they are, a legitimate, business that can handle sensitive data.
Yeah, I was just wondering like if the purpose was more so like, obviously security is important, but more so for like a company just to be like protecting its own like entity.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it kind of goes both ways. It's kind of like security. It does kind of help make sure that, you're covering up loose ends and things like that. But I would say the focus is kind of on the legal and business aspect of things.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Honestly, I like security. I like compliance, or security and compliance. I appreciate them, but I have no interest in it. I kind of hate it.
Okay.
But one of the big reasons for me that it's so daunting. Like I look at those STIGs, right? And there's just thousands of them. And I've actually worked as an IT auditor before, and I came away with like this sense of like, oh my God, it was overwhelming. Like at Hoplite where you work and you're implementing these, these programs, these automation systems, does there come a point in time for you where you're like, okay, I really feel like I have a handle on this. Like I feel like our software is secure and, we've checked the right boxes?
That's a great question. I think it's hard to get to the point where you feel like your software is 100%, vulnerability free. I think that's very optimistic and probably dangerous to have that perspective. I will agree with you in that the STIG stuff is like super overwhelming, and even I like don't really know what's going on. I kind of just trust in this website to make sure that I'm checking the right stuff. But it is hard because like security is always evolving and there's new stuff coming out, and so you always have to keep up with the latest standards and vulnerabilities and things like that. And so I do think it's a forever job in that it never really goes away. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. I kind of wonder, what that threshold of the resources and the time you need to actually devote to it to really hit that 95th, 99th percent.
Yeah, it's tough.
It is. It is. It plagues me. It
Yeah.
plagues my mind.
I do think that's a nice, that's probably a nice way to kind of plug why work at Hoplite is so important. And there's groups like Hoplite that are focusing on automating as much of this as possible because it is a huge, daunting task. And to think about every time you push a new line of code, or every time you stand up a new system, or every time you hire someone new, you almost have to like recheck everything because one thing changes and who knows what that impacted. And so it can be daunting, but at the same time, it's kind of cool. Like there are people who are really focused on like a specific rule and how you can really cleanly check for something, and then they share that to some knowledge base like Stig Viewer or these other systems that kind of aggregate this information, and then Reese and folks at Hoplite and others try to like automate and build a framework around that so that you can go in and help people like at least try to cover as much as possible. Basically just to say, I checked this today. We're good. At least ASLR was enabled on this critical system. So we're good there. We can worry about everything else now.
Yeah.
That is really
a hard problem. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In general, are most of when these STIGs are produced, are they mostly like reactions to like major incidents, or are they produced more like we have people in a lab and they're trying to figure out how to exploit a new system and they found a way, so then they produce a STIG to try to defend against that? Like, I guess, is it a little bit of both, or is it more one or another?
Yeah, I think it's definitely both. I think like a major incident or a major new bug find will definitely spark a new STIG of some kind. Or on, with most operating systems application being constantly updated, it does, open up for new vulnerabilities and things like that. And so I would say it's a little bit of both, and that's there's a few different ways of how new STIGs can be created. Answer your question? Cool. In a class chat, does an NDA count as an example of compliance? In my scope of work through Hoplite, I haven't really seen an NDA formalized as some compliance framework, but I would say in some ways yes, because it's kind of like a set of rules that some employee has to follow, and of making sure that they don't, disclose certain aspects of their work, or send information to some untrusted person. So I would say yes, but I haven't really seen it as like a formal framework or set of rules. Anything else? If I say,
I guess I'll ask some more questions if nobody else has any.
sure.
Another question I have, and maybe Hoplite does solve this problem, but if you're, an indie developer and you're writing your code and blah blah blah, you don't have resources for, a security team or anything like that. What do you do? Like, what advice do you have? And I know there's limitations, but like, what do you do if you're small?
Yeah, so if you're kind of like a small kind of company, you might not have access to experienced people like this and things like
Sure.
that.
Yeah, let's say you're either a startup or this is a passion project.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit I think it is challenging, but in some cases, like compliance frameworks aren't always a requirement for businesses. Like some some businesses don't need to be compliant with some framework. Oftentimes, it is required for some part of contract. But like there is I talked about earlier about how there is like a compliance framework for businesses that deal with credit card information, things like that, and the process for achieving that, there is like a certificate application process for getting certified in that compliance. And I think they do try to make that easy for people who aren't technologically savvy or have an idea of what actually is going on in compliance. So I would say that it is challenging, and I think oftentimes the agencies and that do enforce these compliance frameworks do try to make it easy for small businesses, startups, and things like that. I don't know for sure if that's the case. I'm not an experienced compliance auditor, but that would be my answer.
Perfect. Thank
Yeah.
you. And there's no like tools out there that are kind of like small scale security tools that people use, are there?
Not really. There are kind of some stuff on GitHub that automates this process of checking these rules and things like that. That might be of use for startups and things like that. But I don't know of any tools like off the top of my head that are kind of well known for this stuff.
Cool. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. There's a question that says, when I was in flight school, 90% of my time was memorizing these regulations. Is STIGs kind of the same effect? It's, yeah, and you talk about trying to do the bare minimum to be compliant. I would say, I can't speak for all, system administrators, but I would say that like it's very not normal to memorize every single STIG out there. I think most people do not do that. I think for the most part, they kind of just check the list of all the things they need to do, because most of the time they have that information readily available to them. And I think, unfortunately, but it's understandable, I think most companies like don't really get excited about compliance, and it's kind of just like one thing that they have to worry about, every year, every few years. And so I do think that most of the time it does feel like they just have to do the bare minimum of kind of getting this certificate that they are being compliant with some framework for some legal reason or for some contractual agreement. So I would say it does kind of feel the same, but the memorization I don't think is required.
Yeah, that feels like a question that should be in like a computer science security philosophy class. Like, because I feel like we do this everywhere, right? Like people talk about this with standardized testing in K-12, where like we're basically just teaching people to pass tests, and we're not necessarily teaching them knowledge that has longevity. So in some ways, we're kind of teaching companies to be, I think it was Bowen that maybe asked that question, but kind of like the bare minimum of compliant. But hopefully over time, at least with compliance, I guess maybe I shouldn't get into the K-12 issue, but at least with compliance, hopefully over time, as Reese and folks at Hoplite and others are doing more and more work with this and automating more, and there's more focus on creating these nice STIGs, we kind of raise the bar in terms of like at least everybody at least has like this level of compliance with like what we know to be good practices.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with that.